Canadians.
They're statistically tied. Actually, I think.
But I'm saying he does that.
Subconsciously, consciously doesn't like me.
I think that Canada should be here.
Yeah.
I think so. I mean, I think it should be at the top.
Yeah.
So do I, actually. Canada's made a lot of really strong progress towards freedom. They really have done a good job. Our publisher's Canadian, so I have to talk to them a lot about, and they're always wanting to know about Canada. Now, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, it's pretty difficult with 141 countries to show you the list of all the countries. It'd be very, very small font. And I may know off the top of my head where your particular country of interest is if you have one. But here are some of the larger and more sort of geopolitically important nations around the world and where they score on our index. The colors are basically indicating quartile. So the blue is countries in the top 25%. The greens are the second 25, yellow's third, and the red, kind of a throw to the communist red, I guess. We use red for the bottom 25%. So that's what the colors are indicating if you want to know. And then this is the rating, and then they're ranking where they rank here. You can see that. Now, let me throw out a few observations of things that I've learned from doing this exercise. One thing I've learned is countries like France and Sweden, sort of the big social welfare states of Western Europe, countries that sometimes get called socialist countries. Now you'll see that they don't score in the top 10. In our index they score, but they score sort of around the 25 to 30 percentile mark. They are much closer to number 1 than they are to number 141. All right? And that got me to thinking about all the rhetoric and the discussion we Americans have about Sweden. Should we go the Swedish way? And Sweden's so very different than America. And I would ask you to contemplate whether that's really true. It's really not true. A typical Swedish citizen lives in a private home, private property. If you enter into a contract with two Swedes enter into a contract, that contract is adjudicated by a very, very efficient court system, more so than I would much rather end up in a Swedish court system than an Alabama court system, court any day of the week. The monetary system is very safe. Their trade policy is arguably freer than that of the United States. And except for labor markets, the regulation of economic activity in Sweden, except for labor markets, is no more onerous than it is in the United States. There's two big differences between the United States and Sweden. Their taxes are about 50% higher. We all know that. And their government spending, therefore, is about 50% higher. And their labor market is more tightly regulated than our labor market. But except for taxes and labor markets, structurally speaking, Sweden is a market economy. All right? It's inaccurate to really call it a socialist economy. Now, is it as free market? Is it as Smithian as the United States? No. But it's much, much more Smithian, much more market-oriented than Brazil, or go worse, places like Venezuela. Okay? Venezuela is a great example, where you have one figure, of course, Chavez, who is personally trying to make the country of Venezuela in his image. He's trying to make the whole place the way he wants it to be. He's organizing the little men on the chessboard as he wants it to be. And that's why they get a very low rating. Okay? So Sweden, though, and France and Eastern Germany, these countries that we think of as being big welfare states, yes, they're not as free market as the United States, but they're structurally speaking much closer to the United States, much more similar to the United States than they are dissimilar. Okay? That doesn't mean the differences between Sweden, the United States, and Germany, there are no differences, but the differences aren't nearly as great as the rhetoric would lead you to think if you really listen to the rhetoric. Yes?
So when you talk about all the countries being similar in some ways, so something like a strong court system or make the people hold their property. So even in a pure communist country, they would hold those as value. So even though the field might be communal, it's limited to the community that it's been given to. And if you own something or something's allotted to you and someone takes it, they would certainly agree that the court system should move that from one person to the other. So that seems like something that's just a core societal value, not so much an economic freedom value.
Well, I think that's fair. But I think that to have a free market, a necessary condition is to have that. You know, you can't have a good market though without an efficient court. But the bottom line is that there are places on this world where if you and I have a dispute about who owns a piece of land, there is no sort of fisticuffs or violence. There's really no efficient, quick way of adjudicating that dispute. And so that piece of property is not securely owned by anyone. And so you actually, hardcore, like Soviet-type communist countries are certainly much more secure property in some sense in terms of knowing who owns what and adjudicating disputes about who owns what than a lot of places like, you know, African countries and so forth.
Right, so I think that doesn't make the system work like countries that work well
Yeah.
tend towards the top, which then it doesn't matter what their policies are necessarily, just means that they work well.
No, well, countries that score well on our index tend to work pretty well. But I think some evidence about growth rates would counter that. If you look at countries that start low on the index but get better, countries like China and India, which are still very low rated. If you look at countries that have low ratings but have gotten better, their growth rates invariably have picked up. I mean, it's almost without exception. And so I think that we're not just picking up good governance, in other words. I don't think that's the case. Yeah, yes, sir.
The example of Sweden brings us back to the question that's been raised several times about the leap of faith or your basic premise, and that is of economic freedom. But what if we were to pick as our basic assumption happiness? And there have been surveys using, like this survey, different criteria by which to grade countries. And the Scandinavian countries usually end up at the top of the heap.
Yeah.
Which means that some people like chocolate, some like vanilla, some people prefer economic freedom, other people prefer happiness. The Danes, for example, pay heavy taxes, but they seem to appreciate what they get in return.
I agree completely with the possibility of what you say being true. Indeed, if freedom is a good, whether it's an intrinsic good or an instrumental good, it's still a good. And like all goods can be traded off for other goods. And I admit that this basic economics, there's something of value, there are other things of value, and in a world of scarcity, sometimes we trade one value off for the other. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. So I don't want to argue that necessarily that freedom is, that these guys are wrong to make their choice. Although, when these choices are being made politically, it's awfully hard to say how much an individual, there are individual libertarians in Sweden, it's hard to say whether they agree with it or not, I guess. But no, I think it's perfectly reasonable, in principle, to make that point. I think, yeah. Back here just a second. Was there one more question before I move on? Yes.
I guess this goes back to the issue of weighting, but you discussed the two differences between Sweden and the United States, one of them being higher taxes and expenditures. So I guess on your metric, that's one factor. But in terms of playing out in society, those higher taxes are going to healthcare and education and social welfare. So I don't know how you could take that into account. But
Well, okay, absolutely. And this would be what a Swedish person would say. I've given this talk in Sweden. That's exactly what they say. Yes, but our taxes give us all these good things. That's entirely true, but it makes them less free. Again, I'm not measuring whether or not they're happier or better off. I'm measuring whether they're freer. And when the Swedish government takes 50% of the Swedish citizens' income, they are less free than when an American government takes 25% of American citizens' income, for example. Now, that doesn't mean that it's bad. Maybe they like it. Maybe they like the return that they get from the government services and so forth. And maybe Americans are naive and stupid for not doing it that way. But they're less free in the narrow sense that can I spend the resources that I generate myself, or is there a collective decision being made about how those decisions are spent? That's what I'm measuring, and that's why it's not in there. Now, the separate question is whether or not this is a wise, more is better or less. It's really going to your question as well. That's a completely separate question. I'm still punting on that a little bit.
I actually meant to ask
Yeah.
from the opposite
Okay.
perspective.
Right.
But that, on the chart, the United States and Sweden are, say, there's like a point difference between them, but that difference of government expenditures seems like it should be, not in terms of weighting, like that's gonna influence their economic freedom more than, say, how long it takes to start a business.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm open to arguments about the weighting, I guess is the answer. I really don't have a lot of priors. One of the things that, again, if you give this, it depends a lot on who you talk to on that question. If you talk to Swedish free market people, and there are such animals, believe it or not, they want Area 1 weighted really high, because they want Sweden to be even further down the list. All right? If you give this talk in Latin America, they want areas 2 and 3, which is property rights and sound money, because that's where they've had the biggest problem. So what people think is most important turns out to be highly contextual to what problems they actually have faced themselves, which is why I don't really have a good answer for what the one right weighting system is, because I don't know. Swedes, on the other hand, Swedish socialists or Swedish leftists, I guess maybe a better way to say it, they might say, well, you shouldn't weight number 1 at all. You should weight that, no, it's weighted 20%, you should weight the first area at 0%, because that's good stuff. Okay? You know, it really is hard to say. I can say that at some point, Jim and I and the authors, we simply had to make some decisions in aggregating. All indexes have to do this, they all do this. And it's not entirely defensible. There's a scientific method that I know of to get the best weighting system. I think ours is reasonable, passes a sniff test, at least if you talk to people that think about freedom. Well, taxes matter, so these things matter. We kind of put them together in a way that I think is reasonable, but it's not the only way to do it. Yes. And again, the answers don't actually turn out to matter that much. If you re-weight, Sweden doesn't dramatically become number 1 or become 110 either. They, you know, yeah.
How stationary is are the ratings? How stationary?
Quite, actually. Which is one reason we don't, when we started doing it, we were only doing them every 5 years. Just wasn't much point in doing it more frequently.
So unless freedom is a core value for me, then and these things are stationary, then there's nothing I could identify that changes when a country's index number changes.
Well,
or is there?
No, there are over time, I think I took out the slide, over time there have been changes in a lot of countries, but it's been sort of everybody getting higher ratings as, generally speaking, marginal tax rates around the world have fallen, trade barriers have fallen dramatically. So there's been that. But I guess actually there's certainly been trends in that sense. There hasn't been a lot of movement in the rankings, except for countries like India and China, which have come way up.
What happened to Hong Kong after the takeover?
Almost nothing. Almost nothing.
That's interesting.
Yeah. It give you an indicator, though, of how far Hong Kong is in front. Richard Wong, the president of Hong Kong University, is a hardcore free market nutcase. I mean, the guy's hardcore. He was giving a talk. He was banging it. He was doing a Khrushchev. He's got it. He's mad because Hong Kong's welfare spending has doubled. He's furious about this. It's now 2% of GDP. So I mean, the point is, for reference, transfer spending in the United States is about 14% of GDP, and Denmark is like 25% of GDP. So it's gone from 1% to 2%. So Hong Kong is almost no change. And whatever change there has been unrelated to China. I mean, there's been some, like the recent minimum wage. It wasn't Beijing that wanted to do that. Was just domestic politics.
But that's a good argument for you because he perceives the change in freedom. He perceives it economic. So it's all relative within his own rating.
Yeah, I think the rating for Hong Kong has gone down in number a little bit, but it's so trivial. It's off the radar screen. It's inframarginal, really, in a lot of ways. Yeah.
You only rated 141 countries, but what happened to the other 40?
Well, you'll note that we don't have North Korea, which is 142. No, Cuba is 142, and North Korea is 143. I mean, we don't have a lot of all the countries rated. The simple answer is data availability. Again, I know in my mind where North Korea belongs. They belong at the bottom of any list of economic freedom. That's obvious. But remember methodology. We use third-party data published by the World Bank, the World Economic Forum doesn't give their survey in North Korea, so there's no data. There's literally no data. Now, I could probably just subjectively throw them in at the bottom of the list, and nobody's